neighbors. I want to start out by telling you about the next programs. On October 10, which is a Tuesday, we're going to have with us Nancy Weiss. She's the general counsel for the Institute of Library and Museum Services. And with all the controversies around libraries these days and around what materials museums hold, that should be a very interesting session. Then on November 13, which is a Monday, we have Richard Hoagland. He has long been involved in U.S. diplomacy in Central Asia, that part of the world that has the worst neighborhood you can imagine. Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran, Iraq, and so on. And so he's going to try to tell us something about the tensions in that very interconnected part of the world. And then in December, and I don't have a date yet, we're going to have Michael Toledo. You've probably seen him on a stage if you've been a participant in the theater scene in Washington. But he's more than that. He's not just an actor, but he taught for years at St. Mary's College how to be an actor. And I said to him, I understand being an actor. I can't understand how you teach someone to become one. And so he said, oh, sure, he would come, and he is now an emeritus professor, no less. And so we're going to have him as our sparkling Christmas special. And so join us for those upcoming sessions in our autumn season. Thanks to always to Maygene Daniels and Karen Stuck, without whom the announcements of these things would never get out to the public. Thank you to Mary Bloodworth, who does all our tech support and is coming to us from her home where she's got COVID, but she's being a trooper and is doing our tech support from home. And thanks, as always, to Judy Berman, the director of Capitol Hill Village, without whom none of this would happen. Let me also remind you as we go through tonight that this is being recorded. So whatever you say in questions is going to be recorded and will be available on the Village web and through YouTube. We do ask that you mute yourself unless you are speaking. We do suggest that if during the discussion you have a question and you're afraid you're going to forget it, please put it in the chat. And Mary and I will be watching the chat as we go along and make sure that we get back to you at the conclusion of the remarks. And we do indeed encourage comment. Tonight we have with us Dorothy Robyn. She's had a long and illustrious career in the federal government. She was a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations and Environment. She was the Commissioner of Public Buildings at the U.S. General Services Administration. But outside that, she's been a longtime viewer of what has gone on in the transportation industry, looking at deregulation of trucking, looking at deregulation of airlines, privatization of air traffic controllers, and for at least 20 or 30 years, she's been tracking what's going on with our transportation system. And tonight, I've especially asked her to talk about the airlines because so many of us have had airline experiences recently that have not been really pleasant. So we hope that tonight, at least, we'll get some explanation of what's going on with the transportation system. And here's Dorothy.
Thanks, Trudy. Trudy's blurb said that my talk would make you a more savvy traveler. I think that's probably not the case, but I hope it will make you a more savvy consumer of the policy, the news about airlines and the policy debate. I was the aviation point person in the Clinton White House the last 4 years, and I did aviation consulting for 7 years. I did a year at Brookings working on that. I'll say more about that. 7 years as a consultant, and continued to work on that until the Obama administration decided that they would rather have me at the Department of Defense than at the FAA. And when you hear what I have to say about the FAA, you may understand why they made that decision. So preparing for this talk has been a little bit of catch up for me over the last couple of years. I've been focusing on clean energy. And in my excitement about getting back into aviation, I think I may have kind of like a hostess who prepares too many dishes for the dinner. I may have over prepared, so I may have to kind of cut back on the fly. But let me give it a try. And what I'm going to do is first give you a short history of airline regulation and deregulation. I followed the deregulation process. I wrote my dissertation on deregulation of the trucking industry, and I was a fly on the wall here in Washington watching the same people who had deregulated airlines deregulate trucking. So I will talk about that process and the big effects of airline deregulation. And then I'm going to focus on 4 specific issues that either are controversial and are getting a lot of attention, or that I think should be. One is mergers and consolidation. The second one is ancillary fees, all these fees that the airlines are tacking on. The third is safety. You've read about all these close calls. And then the fourth one is FAA infrastructure, and in particular the air traffic control system. So first, a short history of airline regulation and deregulation. So the airline industry was regulated in 1938 when airlines were in their infancy. So as to the rationale was to prevent cutthroat competition that would jeopardize aviation safety. The regulatory system, which was modeled after the railroad regulatory system, did 2 big things. First, it limited entry. Between 1948 and 1978, when airlines were deregulated, the Civil Aeronautics Board, it had a different name then, but you know it as the CAB, allowed no new airlines to operate, and it allowed existing airlines to operate only on certain routes. The second big thing that the CAB regulation did was to control fares. So airlines were not allowed to compete by offering lower ticket prices. Let me just say that again. Airlines were not permitted to compete on the basis of price. So not surprisingly, the regulated airline industry was stable, profitable, although the profit levels were low, and highly inefficient. And the key indicator of that was that planes flew half empty, and fares were very high. And a lot of us remember those days when it cost $800 to fly one way across the country. Because the airlines couldn't compete on price, they competed on service. Airlines had piano bars on international flights, and they had elegant meal service with scantily clad flight attendants. We called them stewardesses in those days. So flying was a very pleasant experience, and we all remember that. We got dressed up to get on a plane. We got steak, but very few people flew. It was an elite activity. I was 21 before I got on a commercial plane. By the 1960s, some economists began questioning whether there was really a need to regulate the airline industry. And the smoking gun was the comparisons of fares within California and Texas, states that where intrastate airline service was not regulated, to comparable fares intrastate. So San Francisco, LA, fares were about $18. Comparable route on the East Coast, Boston, Washington, D.C., fares were $40-some. That became the smoking gun in the debate, or one of them. By the mid-70s, Ted Kennedy, who had risen to be the chair of a key Senate Judiciary Subcommittee that oversaw antitrust, was looking for a new issue to pursue from his new perch. He persuaded Stephen Breyer, a rising young star at Harvard Law School, to join him in Washington, D.C. And together, they ended up holding 8 days of hearings on this very arcane topic of airline regulation and the Civil Aeronautics Board. and they put the issue on the front page of the Washington Post. By the way, Kennedy did a field hearing in Boston on the same topic, and a woman in the audience said to him, "Senator Kennedy, why are you holding hearings on the airline industry? I don't fly." And he said, "That's why I'm holding hearings on the airline industry." And he often told that story. So with his growing interest in this, a remarkably diverse coalition of interest groups came together, from Ralph Nader's Public Citizen on the left to the American Conservative Union on the right. And they were attracted to airline regulatory reform. It wasn't called deregulation yet, because it was a way to bring tangible benefits to consumers at a time of double-digit inflation. The airline industry itself, not surprisingly, opposed regulatory reform, as did the labor unions. In 1976, Jimmy Carter campaigned as a consumer populist who would reform archaic economic regulation. And shortly after taking office, he put a charismatic economist from Cornell University, Fred Kahn, in charge of the CAB. As CAB chairman, Kahn started administratively making changes, allowing airlines to offer discount fares, peanuts fare, chicken feed fares, giving consumers a taste of what deregulation could bring. And that remarkable coalition, working with Jimmy Carter, Fred Kahn, Ted Kennedy, and this remarkable coalition, by 1978 had persuaded a initially very skeptical Congress to completely deregulate the airlines and sunset the Civil Aeronautics Board. The sunsetting of the CAB was a result of a provision in the bill that Elliott Levitas, congressman from Atlanta, Georgia, Delta, put in as a poison pill. And it's one of those poison pills that somehow made it into the final bill. Delta's slogan, you may remember in those days, was "Delta is ready when you are." And Fred Kahn liked to say at the time, "Delta wasn't ready when I was." So competition quickly led to lower fares, many more flight options, and an explosion in air travel. Demand for air travel turned out to be very price elastic, just the opposite of what the CAB had always assumed was the case. Price elastic means if the price goes down a little bit, demand goes up a lot, or vice versa. So in the decades following deregulation, demand for scheduled air service grew by an average of 4% a year, compared to economic growth of 2.6 for the economy overall. Deregulation democratized air travel, and the benefits continue to flow. Fares today, and Mary, if you could put up the first slide, are 30 to 50% lower in real terms than they were in 1978. This is a complicated slide, and I should say my slides, all of the slides I'm going to be showing tonight, come from the chief economist at A4A, Airlines for America. So they're coming from the Airline Trade Association, but they're based on DOT data. There's really good data on air travel because the system was regulated for so long. And two things. One, you can see from the time series that fares dropped. This starts in 1993, but it doesn't show the full period. The bars are the presence of low-cost carriers on routes. And that's a key thing to keep in mind, that competition from Southwest Airlines and then over time other low-cost carriers played an absolutely critical role in making airline deregulation such a success. Economists have calculated that a third of the benefits, consumer benefits from airline deregulation, are due to just to Southwest Airlines, and they call this the Southwest effect. Competition from low-cost carriers has increased dramatically the last 30 years. I'll say more about that. Predictably, the quality of the service has gone down, in large part because planes now operate 80% full on average. And the airline industry has become a popular target of late night comedians and even consumer groups. Some Democrats who supported airline deregulation recanted. To be sure, some of what the airlines do is beyond the pale, but overall, airlines are giving passengers, what they consistently show a preference for, namely lower fares at the expense of service. So it is only a slight exaggeration to say that the back of the plane is brought to you by deregulation. For passengers who want the luxury of air travel pre-1978, you can fly business class for about what you would have paid for coach absent deregulation. Exposure to competition has led to huge losses for the airline industry. There have been dozens of bankruptcies, liquidation. The turmoil has been enormous, and it's persisted, or it did persist for a long time. Regulation cast a very long shadow, and it's taken the airlines decades to learn how to be profitable in a competitive environment. The industry as a whole has yet to make money in a recession. Warren Buffett summed it up when he said, if a capitalist had been present at Kitty Hawk in the early 1900s, he would have done us all a favor by shooting down Orville Wright. Now, let me, it's a little harsh, but apparently Warren Buffett lost quite a bit of money betting on one particular airline. Let me say just a couple of final things about airline deregulation. First, according to the normal rules of politics, and you guys know these rules, intensity matters. Intensity matters more than numbers. So if you have a small group and they feel very, very strongly about something, that typically wins out over a large group with a very diffuse interest. So by the normal political rules, airline deregulation shouldn't have happened. It did. One friend of mine who was very involved in it said, it's like the bumblebee flying, you know, the old story about how the bumblebee isn't supposed to fly, but by the laws of physics, by the normal laws of politics, airline deregulation shouldn't have happened. There's some wonderful accounts of it, and including some fairly recent ones. Stu Eisenstadt's terrific book on the Carter presidency, the White House years, has a chapter devoted to Jimmy Carter, the consumer populist, and it's largely about deregulation, and it's mostly about airline deregulation. There's another writer who lives here on Capitol Hill, Benjamin Applebaum, who writes for the New York Times and came out with a book in 2019 called The Economist's Hour. And he has a wonderful chapter about Fred Kahn and the other economists involved in airline deregulation. The other point I want to make before I end this section on airline deregulation, the success of airline deregulation paved the way for deregulation of a host of other network industries, including trucking, freight railroads, natural gas, telecommunications, and more. Now, you would have expected some spillover because a lot of these, their network industries, they were subject to similar regulatory systems. But what is remarkable is how far economic deregulation of network industry spread and how quickly once airline deregulation got done. And Breyer has talked, if not written, about that phenomenon. Just one last thing on that point, because Jimmy Carter was familiar with, he knew trucking deregulation as a peanut farmer. He was harmed by it. He hated it. He wanted to dismantle it. The Carter administration made a conscious decision to take airlines first because that would be the easier of the two, of all of the sectors. And then the thinking was if they could win there, they would take on trucking. In his book, Stu Eisenstadt reveals, and this was a surprise to me, that he advised President Carter not to go after the trucking industry, not to take on trucking deregulation. I think he didn't want to piss off the Teamsters. Fortunately, Carter didn't listen to him. Okay, let me talk about the first of the four issues that I want to talk about, which is mergers and consolidation. The most common complaint I hear is that the airline industry has gone from 8 to 4 players, and therefore there's less competition. This is a reference to the 4 big mergers that took place during and after the financial crisis in 2008. So Delta Northwest was the first. Delta acquired Northwest, United Airlines Continental in 2010, Southwest AirTran the same year, and American Airlines US Airways in 2013. And I have a slide, Mary, that shows, again, this is just the big 3 network carriers. This shows you what their networks were like pre-merger and post-merger. The carriers argue, and ultimately the Department of Justice agreed, that the mergers combined route networks that were largely complementary and thus would not harm competition. And you can sort of see that. The one that was the most controversial was that DOJ initially opposed was American US Airways. Most economists I know who study network industries think the mergers have been a necessary and good thing that allow the carriers to improve the efficiency of their network and return to profitability following the 1-2 punch of 9/11 and the financial crisis. And by the way, there is an absolutely wonderful op-ed in, I got it online today it's a New York Times op-ed by Peter Coy, who writes about, if he's not an economist, he should be one. It's about trails, the Appalachian Trail and other trails, but it is also about network effects very explicitly. I'm just going to read you one thing he says. This is today in the New York Times and op-ed. There is an economic angle to trails. It's the network effect, which says that a network grows in value as it adds nodes. A long trail becomes better when a short trail through a special piece of woodland is incorporated into it. The node improves the network. Conversely, the short trail attracts new attention and visitors. The network benefits the nodes. That is the logic of larger networks. Anyway, very timely. So despite that, and despite the views of most economists on this, there still are a lot of skeptics about consolidation, including President Biden, who's being more aggressive on antitrust, part of his administration's policy. The major point I want to make here is to say that to understand the effects of consolidation, you need to look at the individual route level. You can't just say, oh, we've gone from 8 to 4, that's bad. You need to, okay, what does that mean for competition at the route level? If you had, let's say you had just 3 carriers. In one scenario, each of the carriers monopolizes every route, so you have no competition. But under another scenario, all 3 carriers compete on every route. Those are very different worlds. To understand which of those they are, you have to look at the individual route level, or city pair market is what DOJ calls it. So that's the key point. When you talk about competition in the airline industry, you have to talk about at the route level. And the other point is that low-cost carriers all along have been the driver of competition. If passengers have a low-cost carrier option on a route, it will discipline the fares of even the non-low-cost carriers. Let's see, the next slide, Mary. Now, low-cost carriers come in different flavors now. It started just with Southwest. Then you got JetBlue, Hawaii, and Alaska. They offer lower costs, not low cost, lower costs with amenities. So they have a different business model. And then most recently, the ultra low cost carriers like Spirit is the one, and it's the butt of the most jokes, Frontier. And there's 2 new ones, Breeze, which was started up by David Neeleman, who began JetBlue, and Avalo, which was started by the former CEO Allegiant, I think it is. So you've got different flavors of low-cost carriers. So in going back to the question of what do we think the effect was of going from 8 to 4 big carriers? First of all, next slide, Mary, consolidation has not, and look now at the 3 bars on the right of the screen. Consolidation has not reduced the number of competitors on city pair markets. That number has increased steadily over the last 2 decades. And you can see what those numbers are. Those numbers reflect any carrier that has at least 5% of the market. If you raise the bar to only carriers with 10% of the market, the numbers aren't quite as big, but the trend line is still the same. So competition at the root level is increasing, not decreasing. The second is that, and here look at the bars on the left. Low-cost carriers are growing at rates several times that of the big 3 network carriers: American, Delta, and United Airlines. Hawaiian, let's see, JetBlue, Alaska, and Hawaiian. That's the red bar. They've gone from 4% of the market in 2000 to 12% in 2022. Ultra low-cost carriers have gone from 2% to 12% of the market. So low-cost carriers are going gangbusters in terms of growth. Low-cost carriers, including Southwest, now carry nearly half of all domestic passengers. So they have overtaken the big 3 network carriers in terms of, they've taken market share away from the big 3, from the network carriers. They have gone from 73% of the market to 52% of the market. So you often hear that the big 4 airlines control more than 70% of the market. That's true, but that glosses over the fact that one of the big 4 is Southwest, a low-cost carrier. So if you put Southwest in the low-cost category, they control almost half of the market. And next slide. And because of this rapid growth of low-cost carriers, 80 to 90% of all passengers in the US have a low-cost option on their travel route. And that's important, again, even if they have no interest in flying the low-cost carrier, because the presence of that carrier disciplines the non-low-cost carriers. In short, competition in the industry is very strong. And let me just quickly say something about the next slide. And this is, you've seen this slide before. There is currently 2 airlines that want to merge: JetBlue from the middle, from a lower cost carrier, and Spirit. JetBlue wants to acquire Spirit. DOJ is opposing it. DOJ is saying that would take Spirit, an ultra low cost carrier, out of the equation. JetBlue is saying, yes, it would, but what I want to do is I want to compete against United, American, Delta, and Southwest and become the 5th biggest nationwide carrier. And acquiring Spirit is the best way to do that, because they have planes and crew to operate them. And it would take JetBlue, they say, 8 years to acquire the same number of aircraft and crew that they organically that they can get from acquiring Spirit. So we don't know how this is going to play out. I have, in the course of getting ready for this talk and reading about this, I've decided I think DOJ's view on this is static, and I think it reflects the Biden administration pushing them to be tougher on antitrust. My inclination is to think that the value of having JetBlue as over time a 5th national competitor outweighs the loss of Spirit as an ultra low cost carrier. Okay. All right. Second issue I want to talk about: ancillary fees, or what economists call unbundling. This is another very common complaint that airlines are charging for amenities that used to be part of the viewed as routine and part of the regular price, blanket, snacks, checked baggage, so forth. And President Biden has gone after junk fees, and he specifically refers to the airlines, and not just the airlines, but in referring to junk fees. They've become an important source of revenue for airlines. And economists like ancillary fees, which they refer to as unbundling. They believe it is pro consumers. Air travelers don't like them, but they do like the lower fares they make possible. So let me tell you a little bit about how they came about, and I think you will be more sympathetic to them. So Spirit and Irish ultra low cost carrier Ryanair were the first to introduce ancillary fees in 2000. Spirit noticed that a third of their passengers weren't checking their bag. And so they instituted a $20 bag fee. And at the same time, they lowered all of their fares across the board by $20. So those who checked the bag paid no more than they did before. Those who didn't check saved $20. Spirit then expanded that to seat assignment and other things. Before unbundling, their Spirit's average one-way fare was about $105, and they collected $5 in other charges. 5 years later, their average fare was $70, and they collected about $45 in ancillary fees. The industry picked up on this, and the use of ancillary fees has grown. The key reason, this goes back to this elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of demand for travel. A small reduction in price can bring into the market a much larger, a relatively large number of passengers who are looking to get a very, very low price. When you unbundle those things that some travelers don't care about, like checked baggage, you pull that base fee down even lower and pull in passengers who would not otherwise choose to or could not otherwise afford to pay. So it is a way of further lowering the entry point for traveling, for air travel. So that's the big reason, and that's why economists love the idea. A second reason is that ancillary fees are stickier than ticket prices. Ticket prices are very variable. Air travel is variable. It's variable across the week. It's extremely variable across seasons. So airlines have fixed costs, but there's variable revenue from ticket prices. The ancillary fee revenue is more stable. And so that's a big benefit. Even if they're getting only 15 to 20% of their revenue from ancillary fees, that helps them stabilize their quarterly earnings. I think the big issue is the transparency of the fees, and there is an FAA reauthorization bill going through now, and there is at least one provision in there that the Biden administration has pushed that would make it more transparent. I know the airlines don't like it. It's relatively easy to be transparent when you're talking about an air carrier's own website. When you get into a third-party website, it becomes more complicated. So we can see how that turns out, but I don't think ancillary fees are going to go away. Okay, the third issue I want to talk about is aviation safety. Air travel is extremely safe. We have not had a commercial accident in the United States since 2009. That's remarkable. It is remarkable. If I'd given this talk 2 or 3 years ago, I probably wouldn't even have included safety as a topic. But this year we have seen or heard about a flurry of near collisions on or close to airport runways. I won't give examples, but you've read about them. The initial news coverage of those led the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, which oversees aviation safety, to hold a safety retreat in March. I haven't seen a transcript, but I think much of the discussion focused on the fact that many of the pilots and other personnel now working in aviation have less experience, and that's because COVID prompted a lot of early retirements and buyouts and so forth. So when passengers came back in large numbers in 2021, 2022, the airlines had to, or were forced to, expedite training and promotion, and that has led to some lack of adequate experience in pilots and others. Now, a month ago, the New York Times did a front page story. It's a doozy of an article called "Airline Close Calls Happen Far More Often Than Previously Known." The reporters got access to federal databases not generally available to the public or to journalists, including a NASA database of confidential reports from cockpit crews and air traffic controllers. There were a lot of accounts of near collisions, and the reporters flagged two big issues as being responsible. One is that lack of runway incursion, automated runway incursion equipment to flag a runway incursion before it happens. The FAA has put automated equipment in only 43 of 100 and I think it's 132 large, medium, and small hub airports. The National Transportation Safety Board has told the FAA to put these systems in many more airports. The FAA has added none. That's a big goose egg since to the list since 2017. I should note that some of these near collisions have happened at airports with runway collision technology, so it isn't a panacea, but the lack of deployment by the FAA is a problem. The second problem the New York Times authors described is the egregious shortage of fully trained controllers in FAA towers and centers and other facilities, and this is particularly a problem in the Northeast. So over the last decade, the number of fully trained controllers has shrunk by 10%, while air traffic has increased by 5%. The FAA is making extensive use of 6-day work weeks and a work shift called the rattler because it leads to sleep dysfunction. The problems, both of these problems reflect long-running budget issues about which I'm going to say more in a minute. As I say, there is an FAA reauthorization bill. Now it's an every 5-year bill. The House passed it in July, I think. The Senate is debating it now. So we will see this. Congress was on vacation when the story came out. I think there will be some response to this story. The story was, New York Times story was such a big deal. There's a whole bunch more to talk about under aviation safety, but let me get to the last point, which is aviation. It's a closely related point, the FAA and aviation infrastructure. And by that, I mean runways and airways, and I'm going to focus on airways and the air traffic control system. So in March of 1978, I'm going to go back to Fred Kahn, 6 months before airline deregulation passed. Fred went over and gave a speech to senior FAA officials. They had begun to figure out, and Fred was telling them, hey, you know, we're going to unleash a tremendous amount of demand when we deregulate the airline industry. You guys need to be ready for that. You need to respond on the infrastructure supply side. And since you can't just lay down a new runway overnight, he was talking about some pricing issues, better pricing of runway landings. But what was interesting is the FAA, their response to him was, can't you, the CAB, do something to control this? Can't you let the airlines coordinate their schedules? Can't you put some controls? And Fred, in response, said, his response essentially was, are you freaking kidding me? This is what he actually said. At a time when we at the CAB are trying to restore economic rationality to this industry by placing increasing reliance on the competitive market to allocate scarce resources, we are not about to embrace non-market controls in order to solve the problem of limited airport space. The FAA blew off Fred's recommendations, which he later expanded to include other things, including appropriate pricing of the airways themselves and also structural reform of the air traffic control system. And I worked with him on that. It's an important set of reforms, and one I've pushed at 3 different stages in my career. First in the White House, post White House, working with Fred and others before 9/11, eliminated the need to worry about congestion and delays. And then again in 2017, 2018, when Bill Schuster, the Republican chair of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, was a profile in courage and trying to do something similar to what we had tried to do in the Clinton administration. And let me just give you a little bit of context, and then this is my white whale in life, so I get very passionate, but I also need to wrap up. So let me say a couple of things, because when I tell people this at a cocktail party, you know, it's like, what? You want to privatize the air traffic control system? Are you kidding me? I mean, that's so here are the two arguments. Air traffic control, it's a bunch of equipment and 35,000 controllers and engineers whose job is to keep planes safely separated as they go from one point to another. It is not an inherently governmental function. Air traffic control is not inherently governmental. Keeping planes safely separated is complex and safety critical, but it's a purely operational process, which, like running an airline or building a Boeing 787, can be performed effectively by a non-governmental entity as long as it's subject to safety oversight. Second, precisely because it's operational in nature, the government faces serious challenges in running it. And I'll just read you. This is my summary of the problem. That air traffic control is a 24/7 service, technology-intensive service business housed in a regulatory agency that is constrained by federal budget rules, burdened by a poorly designed funding mechanism, and micromanaged by Congress and OMB. And I could talk about vacuum tubes and paper strips and the things that, you know, the terrible technology that the FAA has not been able to get beyond. This issue is dead right now. There is absolutely no constituency for privatizing air traffic control. So I'm not gonna belabor that. But the point I want to make, and I'm going to close with this point, is that the FAA, first of all, the FAA is a conflict of interest because it is regulating the entire aviation system, including the air traffic control system, and it also operates that system. So it's self-regulating. But I think what the safety stories, the continued problems with modernizing air traffic control, what they show is this is what Congress and the Biden administration should be focused on, not the width of seats, not ancillary fees. Mergers, that's important. I would never say don't worry about that. But I think we worry about the wrong things. We worry about amenities, and that's something that should be largely left to the market. The government needs to regulate safety, enforce antitrust, and provide infrastructure. And it is doing a terrible job of providing infrastructure. So when you experience delays, don't blame the airline, blame the FAA and Congress's failure to step up on this issue. I think I've gone, Trudy, I think I've gone over time.
Oh, but it's been wonderful, Dorothy. I've learned a lot, and I'll bet everybody else has too. I don't see anybody in the chat, so let's look for hands. Who has questions or comments? I'm looking and not seeing.
It looks like Maureen has her hand down.
Okay, if she does, let's let her in.
There. I'm wondering, what do you think of the job that Pete Buttigieg is doing at transportation?
Well, I think that his instincts are good, and I signed up with the Buttigieg clean energy team when he first announced, because I like his, as you can tell, I'm a market-oriented Democrat. I'm not an economist, but I sometimes play one on TV, and I liked Buttigieg's market orientation. I think, but he's in an administration that's very, he's in a very political job. And so I think he's out there talking about ancillary fees when he should be talking about the problems with the air traffic control system. So, if I saw him on the Hill, and I haven't run into him, but I didn't want to lay that on him, I would say, spend more time thinking about infrastructure. And I should say that the guy who the Biden administration just nominated to be the FAA administrator, Mike Whitaker, he's very good. I have hopes there. I think that was a really good choice. He was the deputy FAA administrator in the first part of the Obama administration. I know him when he was a young United Airlines lawyer. And I think he gets it. If I were him, I would have made acceptance of the job of agreeing to be nominated. I would have made that conditional on getting more resources. A lot of this is resources. The Biden administration is pouring money into clean energy. I love it. They're not, the FAA isn't getting what it needs. That has not historically been the problem. The FAA's problems are much more structural than that, but I think now they're just not getting the resources they need to hire enough controllers, to deploy enough technology.
Okay, who else has a question? Mary Fraker, you had a couple questions right when we started. Would you like to rephrase any of those?
Mary asked about one thing, Mary. So Mary pointed out there is an FAA reauthorization bill going through. The big issue that's hanging it up in the Senate is the question of raising the retirement age for pilots. So there are many people think we've got a shortage of pilots. One way to deal with that shortage is let pilots fly for an additional 2 years. The pilots union, American ALPA, Airline Pilots Association, very good organization. They're staunchly opposed to that. So I don't know how that'll get worked out. Maybe there'll be a compromise on a year for starters.
Other people, questions?
There's a couple people on here that I wouldn't mind calling on just to get their perspective. One is Bernard Asare, who is a MIT aeroastro rocket scientist and a student of John Hansman, the great aviation guru at MIT. Bernard doesn't work for the FAA because I think he would find it too frustrating, and maybe he can reinforce some of what I said. Bernard, can you get off mute?
No. I am literally afraid of speaking up in this forum.
He's a neighbor, by the way. He lives in the 600 block of East Street. These are your neighbors. You're speaking to neighbors.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, no, I couldn't reinforce Dorothy's message more. I think the concept of privatizing the FAA or commercializing the FAA, as I like to call it, or air traffic control, is definitely something that one could consider, but I think it's a long-term project. The Canadians have done it. A couple of smaller ANSPs in Europe have done it, and it works. Right? Airplanes aren't falling out of the sky. Airplanes aren't crashing into each other, and it fundamentally works. So couldn't agree more. As to the other points, I'm here as a technologist, not a politician or a policy setter. we can talk about the technologies required to move the system forward.
So when we proposed spinning off air traffic control as part of reinventing government in the Clinton administration in 1995, 4 countries had done this. New Zealand, Australia, Germany, no, not Germany, but 2 others. Our proposal was dead on arrival. When Bill Schuster came back to that issue 25 years later, the rest of the world had gotten the memo. So everybody, but France and, Namibia has now done this. I mean, it's remarkable how many countries did something like, they don't all use the word privatize, but it's a monopoly. It's still a monopoly, but giving it the autonomy to run like a business. And the impediment, and this, I didn't have time to get into this, but the political impediment is the 0.1 percenters who fly business jets and who are heavily subsidized by the current system. They fly under the cover of general aviation. Those are dentists who fly on weekends as opposed to business jets. And that has been a political formula for blocking this, and it's absolutely outrageous.
Dorothy, we've got one in the chat that says, can you comment on the recent news story about pilots covering up professionally disqualifying medical issues?
Yeah, that was one of the other things under safety, and I don't know enough about that. It sounds right. It sounds right to me, because I know, it's just, if that comes out, that's career ending. But I don't know enough about how they found that out and what the FAA is doing about it. By the way, this database that the New York Times reporters got access to, and they called it a NASA database, and I don't know if it's the same or separate, but from this, but in the Clinton administration, the FAA created a program to get pilots and others to report on near misses. And the reason for that is there were no longer enough accidents happening for them to be able to glean lessons learned from the accidents. I mean, an accident is a wealth of information about what to avoid. But when we got down to having so few accidents, where do you go for those lessons learned? So they created this program, I forget the acronym, for people, and they gave pilots and others basically indemnification to talk about near misses. And so I think that may be what the reporters got access to. And I think he needs something similar for the mental health issue.
Yes, Joe Scarfatti. Sorry.
Joe, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Joel, you're on mute. Mary, can you unmute Joel? Maybe not. I can't.
Unfortunately, all I can do is ask. There you go.
There we go.
Ah, good. Okay. We still can't hear you.
We still can't hear you, Joel. Okay. Can you type it in the chat for us?
Doesn't have his microphone plugged in.
Okay. Is Roger Natsuhara on the call? Roger is the chief engineer at MWA, Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. I thought one interesting issue is this fight over the perimeter rule, whether longer flights should be, whether national airports should be handling more longer flights. This is a fight between, I think it's Delta and American.
Yeah.
What position would you take on it?
Well, so this is one where I deviate from my economist colleagues. Economists don't like perimeter rules. They all say, no, let it just open it up, and use congestion pricing to control. And I think we have a system that makes sense. I don't like the idea. I like what the House did, which is to vote down the proposal for more long range flights out of DCA.
I'm going to ask
Franz Agnello, do you want to ask something?
So Dorothy, you almost made an offhand comment about the 1%ers being opposed.
0.1 percenters.
0.1 percenters. Okay, being opposed to the privatization of the no.
Well, yeah, opposed to change in funding. Yeah. Yeah, so they pay a gas tax now. I mean, there's two groups. There's the dentists who fly on weekends, and they pay they pay a gas tax. That's fine. I mean, they don't add to the cost of the system. The business jet guys, they do. They do, because as air traffic controllers say, a blip is a blip. If you're an air traffic controller, it costs the system the same to handle a business jet or a regional jet as it does a big jumbo jet. It's going through the system. You have to treat it the same. And that is how we should be pricing, based on the cost to the system of handling individual flights. That is not what we do. You pay an ad valorem tax on your ticket.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's crazy. So the amount of revenue coming out of an individual plane and going into, and that's what funds the FAA, is based on how much people paid for their tickets. It's not based on what their cost is to the system. So if you went to a rational system, the business jets would have to pay more. Now, I should say we held them, we said, we will hold you harmless. And Bill Schuster did the same thing. Absolutely, we will hold you harmless. And they just, they said, we don't believe you. We don't believe you. And, this is trade association politics. Trade associations need issues, and this is a great issue for that trade association. But it is absolutely outrageous when you see how big the subsidies these guys are getting.
We pay for
Dorothy, in the minute we've got left, you haven't talked about one issue that we all face: lost luggage.
Oh. Yeah. So there actually are people here who check their bags.
Yeah.
Because I have what I think is a deviant view. The airlines try to get you to carry your bags on. That's part of what the ancillary fee is for checked bags. It is an effort to get you to carry your bag on. That way, there's fewer bags for them to lose. Their conveyor belts last longer. All these good things. To me, it imposes costs in terms of longer boarding and, more important, longer deboarding. So I really don't like. I would like to flip the incentive, but I'm not in charge. So yeah, no, I have no secrets. I actually picked up the wrong bag at DCA. It was identical to mine. I got home, I was just unzipping. It's a horrible feeling when you unzip your bag and see somebody else's clothes. And 5 minutes later, the airport was on the line. So they had tracked it very quickly.
Well, thank you, Dorothy. It's been just a wonderful evening. We've all learned lots. And everyone, please put on your calendars October 10. It's a Tuesday, when Nancy Weiss will be with us and talking about what's going on with libraries and museums in the United States. So please, everybody. Dorothy, you've been great.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming.